In today's video, I go back almost 40 years to recreate my favorite wargaming triumph of all time, playing the classic Swords and Spells tabletop miniatures game written by the legendary Gary Gygax. Well, hey folks, it's Lee from SkirmishWargames.com. Welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about my favorite wargaming moment, and this goes back to the early days, probably to the early 80s, using a rule system called Swords and Spells, written by no other than Gary Gygax himself for use with original Dungeons & Dragons. So way back in the early days of D&D, or perhaps even before that, Gary and a guy named Jeff Perrin wrote a book called Chainmail, Rules for Medieval Miniatures. And in this rule set, they not only included their take on some historical rules, but they included some elements of fantasy as well here in the back. So Chainmail was sort of the predecessor of Swords and Spells, which was more directly related to Dungeons & Dragons. In fact, I think this was designed to work with the original Dungeons & Dragons rule set, though we used it with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons with our Monster Manual and Player's Handbook and some of the information in there. So you needed some of the weapon information and armor information from here. You needed some of the monster information from here. And then you could use the Swords and Spells rules to create large-scale tabletop battles in the Dungeons & Dragons universe. So yeah, rules for large-scale miniatures battles based on the game Dungeons & Dragons. Dedicated to all swords and sorcery gamers, past, present, and future, by Gary Gygax. So there's a couple of interesting things about this rule set, as pointed out by Timothy Kask here in the foreword. One, they consider this rule set to be sort of the grandson of Chainmail. Two, it incorporates fantasy elements. There were no doubt other rule sets at the time that covered the nuts and bolts of medieval warfare. But in Swords and Spells, you could also field orcs, elves, dwarves, monsters, wizards, heroes, magic items, what have you. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about this rule set is that, as they point out here, for one thing, there is no luck in assessing casualties. There's no dice rolling, almost. So basically everything's done by a table. So you look at the troop, the weapon they're using, the armor they're facing, any modifying factors, and you come up with a number, and that's it. So you're not rolling any dice. Now you do roll dice for morale, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but for the most part, it's a diceless war game. So the scale in this game is that usually one miniature represents 10 troops. In our case, when we were kids, we didn't have a whole lot of miniatures, so often one figure would represent 50 troops or 100 troops or whatever we needed to do. And of course, individual models could also represent individual heroes or monsters or whatever. So yeah, as an introduction to wargaming, my friends and I really enjoyed this. It was pretty simple to use. It was connected to Dungeons & Dragons, so we recognized a lot of the concepts. And it was just kind of a fun way, instead of just throwing your miniatures on the floor in a big mob, to have some structure. Here is the point value list for army creation, which we're going to refer to in a bit. And then this was kind of fun. This was a little sample scenario they had in the back, showing some sample armies and then kind of giving you an early battle report of how the gameplay went. And must have read that a dozen times. Oh, and one last thing before we get on to my favorite wargaming moment of all time. This is an old book. These original copies are kind of hard to come by, but fortunately, you can buy Swords and Spells not only as a PDF, but also as a print-on-demand paperback book. This is a later edition. You can see this one's got the wizard on it as opposed to the lizard man. But still basically the same rules, and all the good stuff's in there. And I think this is about 10 bucks maybe for a printed version, so well worth it. I will put a link if you're interested in the description for the video, or if you are watching this on SkirmishWargames.com, I'll put a link in the story underneath the video. So you can check that out if you're so interested. But in the meantime, let's travel back to the 80s, the Stranger Things era, maybe a little before that, and talk about my favorite wargaming moment of all time as a player using the Swords and Spells rule set. And why is it my favorite? I don't know. It just was perfect. It was one of those things. There wasn't any skill involved, no tactics or anything like that. It just worked out in such a cinematic fashion that it stuck with me to this day. So this was actually a little bit of a challenge to reconstruct the scenario. I knew what happened. I knew the people involved. I knew the forces that they had because the armies were pretty simple. But then I had to kind of refer to the rule book and the point values and the measurements and everything like that to reconstruct what happened, kind of like the History Channel, because it was one of those things. A war game is a matter of inches sometimes, and if things didn't work out exactly the way they did, then none of the events would have taken place the way they did. But let me show you kind of what was going on, and I think you get a kick out of it. So my buddy Vic, who I'd known since the third grade, and he was, if not the smartest guy in school, certainly one of the smartest, he said, let's do a Swords and Spells battle. Vic and our friend Scott would be on one team, while our friend Ron and I would be on the other. Vic said, let's do a 10,000 point battle. You guys make your own armies in secret, and we'll make our armies in secret, and then we'll see who wins. So 10,000 points is more than enough to make a small force, you know, some infantry, some cavalry, some archers, some what have you. But apparently we all had the same idea, and basically we each just built one big unit. So for my 5,000 points, and I gotta tell you, so these are probably some of the first miniatures I ever painted. So it's amazing that I actually painted miniatures for a battle. So these are old metal miniatures, probably about 25 millimeter from a company called Partha. They're made out of lead. They're painted with Tester's model paint, probably under the light of a 40-watt desk lamp. But it's amazing that I got them painted at all. So my army was going to be 5,000 points of cavalry. And mainly because heavy lances did double damage on a charge. So if you could line up a charge, you could do a lot of damage in the first strike from the first rank. So this is 250 first level elite horsemen on heavy war horses. And the way the points break down in Swords and Spells is basically you pay for the hit points of the horses and the riders. Then you got to pay a bonus to make them elite. Then you pay through the nose for armor. So it's 1,000 points just to make the riders armor class 4. Then lances, that's a long weapon, that's an extra 250 points. So my 250 horsemen there is almost 5,000 points, but I did have a little bit left over. So with my extra points, I wanted a monster, I wanted a rock chucker. This is an old, I don't know who this is from. This is a Cyclops, and back in the day you had the Monster Manual, which was published by TSR, but you also had other companies publishing their non-canon, sort of unsanctioned monster manual type books with all kinds of other monsters in it that you could use with Dungeons and Dragons. And somebody published rules for a Cyclops and said that the rock range on a Cyclops is 48 inches. So I got this Cyclops. Now this guy is not hardly any bigger than an elf, but he's technically a Cyclops. So that's what I used. That's the very miniature that I used. But for the sake of our demo today, we'll use this WizKids large Spriggan, I guess. He's not technically a Cyclops, but he looks pretty dynamic. So we'll use him in place of the Cyclops. I also had this funky little cannon here. Back when we used to buy miniatures mail order, there was no internet, obviously. Oftentimes you'd get just a price sheet and an order form from a casting company or whatever, and it would just have a line item. It would just say, flaming spear-throwing cannon. You might assume it was a ballista, which I did, but you wouldn't know what it was until you actually received it. You'd have no idea. So this is my lead ballista, unpainted. I think this is like a Kobold crew, and it looks like they're sort of poking that guy in the rear end to fire the cannon. So, but that's what I used as a ballista. Nobody complained about it. So I think I paid 20 points for this in the game. Probably not worth it because it could only fire one turn out of every 4, but you could back it up out of longbow range and, you know, spear a couple of elves. So I did it. So that's my army. Ron, on the other hand, basically went with lizardmen. Going back to ye old monster manual, there's a lizardman. He is a 2-hit die +1 monster, so he's about twice as tough as a man. More advanced ones can actually use shields and live in huts and things like that. So Ron had some of the more advanced lizardmen. He had 500 of them, and that was his army. So the thing about lizardmen is they're kind of primitive. They can't form a lot of the other formations like a line or open order or things like that. They could form a mass or a column mass, basically a giant square or a giant rectangle, if they had enough troops. He didn't have enough troops to do that. They were too expensive. So we're going to treat this as unorganized. So this is just a mob of lizardmen, which is kind of good because in a mass or a column mass, they can only move 6 inches a turn. As an unorganized mob, they can move 9, so they're a little bit speedier. So that was his guys, basically 500 lizardmen, AC4, with hand weapons and javelins. Javelins, you can toss 2 javelins a turn. You can do a maximum of 4 volleys before you run out of ammunition. And for some reason, javelins cost 0 on the point values, I guess because the range is so short. And we're using, obviously, some WizKids lizardmen to proxy in the old Lizardman models that he had back in the day, which I don't have copies of. Now, we didn't know what Vic and Scott were going to come up with. We just made our armies, our cavalry and our lizardmen, so we're the horse and lizard army. Vic and Scott, though, got a little sneaky. So Vic looked at the army building stats and decided to max out on elven archers. For the sake of this demonstration, we are using pre-painted miniatures from Confrontation Age of Ragnarok to represent all the archers. Victor's archers didn't have anything. They had basically togas, sandals, a sword, and a longbow. These guys have helmets and breastplates, which his elves didn't have. So his elves would have looked more like that. This is an old miniature from a company called Custom Cast from 1975, and I guess they got merged with Heritage a couple of years later, but another lead mini, so wash your hands pretty good before you eat the pizza. I don't know if we always did that. So when Vic was making his army, he wanted to max out the number of archers he could get. So he has 1,100 elven archers. I couldn't even fit them all on this table. Imagine this is taking place on the carpeted floor of the guest bedroom back when I was a kid. And so we're spread out. But in this case, in my 3x3 board here, I could get 1,000. I couldn't quite get 1,100 on here. So basically, Vic looked at the chart and said, okay, elves by themselves, you got to pay a premium for. So that's 1,100 for the elves. Hit points, 660 points. Armor class 9, which is basically nothing. If you give them armor class 9, you're actually making 1,100 points because it's minus 10 per 10-man unit. So he made up 1,100 points by giving them no armor at all. And then he gave them longbows, which are really expensive. It cost him 4,400 points just to equip all those elves with longbows, bringing his army total to 5,060 points. A little bit over, but not too terrible. And then curiously, he put them all in one big line. So this is all one gigantic unit in a line formation for those elven archers. Now behind the line of elven archers, there's also a line of 1,100 dwarves with chainmail and shield, and they're apparently backing up the elves. Now dwarves are very slow. Their base movement is only 4 inches, and their charge range is 2, so they're really not very practical. But he wanted dwarves apparently, so those dwarves are standing there in a line, resolute, waiting to do something. So this is 4,950 points of dwarves, basically just dwarves with an axe, shield, and chainmail. So pretty sturdy, but not very quick. And as with that archer miniature I showed you before, these dwarves are from Custom Cast in the mid-70s and made out of lead. So I'll be washing my fingers later on, but that's what we had back in the day. And I even started to paint them a little bit, as you can probably see, but not the greatest, but at the time it was serviceable. It sufficed. So in this case, what Vic did, and it's pretty clever of him, he basically says, I'm going to have a huge line of elven archers, and I'm basically going to decimate anything that tries to march up to me. So imagine a line of dwarves trying to march up to this line of archers. They would have gotten just shot to pieces before they even got there. Because in this game, archers, if they stand put with longbows, can shoot 3 times a turn. At the beginning, in the middle of the movement phase if they forego movement, and then at the end if they haven't moved. So they can lob a lot of arrows. So I don't know what he was expecting. He didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know what he was doing. But he might have been expecting more of a mixed force with some infantry, maybe a little cavalry, maybe some archers, that he could basically just pick apart at range before they ever closed. However, in wargaming, as in life, sometimes the best laid plans don't always work out, and in this case, the end result was kind of comical. So I thought you might get a kick out of a mini battle report of what happened back in the early 80s when the lizards and horsemen met the elves and dwarves on the field of battle. Okay, so the turn sequence in Swords and Spells is basically you have sides A and B, and they alternate. So one turn, one team will be side A, and the next turn the other team will be side A. So basically the way it works is the beginning of the turn, if anybody's got loaded missile weapons, they fire simultaneously. Then the army that's designated side A gets to move up to half their movement. Then side B gets to move up to all their movement. Then side A gets to move the rest of their movement. Then the next turn it flips. So these bowmen can fire 3 times a turn with their longbows if they don't move at all. But if they want to move, they have some options. They can fire 1 volley and then do their full movement. They can do their full movement, fire 1 volley. They can fire, move half, and fire again. But what they can't do, what they specifically cannot do, is fire, and move, because they've already sat out the movement phase firing arrows. But Victor's plan was pretty simple. He was just going to stand put and lob as many arrows as he could on the oncoming troops, hoping to decimate them and or make them rout. Because if you put enough of a hurt on the various troops coming your way, they have to make morale checks. If they fail those morale checks, they become shaken, then disordered, and then they rout, which means they take off heading in the other direction as fast as they can. So if you look at this list, you look at these armies, obviously some of it was designed for comic effect rather than maneuvering. They weren't going to be moving around much. They were just going to wait for us to roll into them and basically try to perforate us with as many arrows as they could, and then maybe the dwarves would mop up the stragglers. I don't know. Now, someone might argue, what's the fun? Where is the great strategy in just standing put and perforating your enemy with arrows? And I don't know, for the grins, I guess. That was the strategy we were facing, and we weren't much better. We were just going to charge forward and trample them underfoot or bonk them on the head with a big lizard man club. But anyway, here's what happened. So leading up to where we are now, this is kind of the beginning of turn 2. So let me give you some history to get us, through turn 1. So imagine that all of the troops on Team Lizard and Horse are outside a longbow range, and we're starting our advance toward the enemy. So first things first, I have a Cyclops. And his range from the non-sanctioned monster book that wasn't published by Dungeons & Dragons says that he can throw a rock 48 inches. So he's way out of the 21-inch range of the longbows. And he's going to lob a big rock, a 30-point rock, and just looking at the table, it squashes 5 elves. So this rock comes through, does 30 points of damage. Elves has 6 points apiece. So 5 of them are crushed. That doesn't really make much of an impact since there's 1,100 of them, but it is satisfying. The ballista here is not quite within its 30-inch range, so it's going to rumble forward a little bit to try to get within 30 inches of the longbowmen, but not be within 21 inches, which is their archery range. So after the Cyclops has thrown his rock and the ballista has rolled forward with its kobold crew, the heavy cavalry moves forward half their movement, which is 6 inches because they have 12-inch movement. And the lizard men, represented here by some WizKids plastic miniatures, also move forward half of their 9-inch movement. They'd be slower if they were in formation, but they're an unorganized mob, so they're moving 9. So now it's time for side B. They have the option of moving their full movement at this point, but they don't do that. They're going to stand put. The archers also have the option of doing some mid-turn fire, but because no one's within long range of the longbows, they don't fire either, so they just stand pat, so they're not moving at all. So the heavy horse and the lizardmen move the second half of their movement, and this brings them within long range of the longbows. So the elves have been sitting pat this whole time, and because the horsemen are now within range, they unleash a volley of arrows. The way we would do it is we'd kind of see what ranks were sort of in range. Now at long range, longbow does 1 to 3 points of damage. At short range, it does 1 to 6 in the Swords and Spells rule system. Once you get into medium range of a longbow, you lose 1 point of armor, and once you get into short range, you lose 2 points of armor, so they must have a lot more armor-piercing power at short range. But still, even at this range, 21 inches, most all of them can fire on this wing of the army. And then it just seemed logical to us that the sergeants would say, okay, you 600 fire over here and you 500 fire over here, rather than these guys just kind of standing there and not shooting at anything. So that's what happened. 600 elves fired at the heavy horsemen, and about 500 over here fired at the lizardmen. So consulting the damage chart and then multiplying it out by the number of troops who fired, we determined that the elves do 300 points of damage against the lizardman unit and 420 points against the heavy horses. Not quite enough to make them make a morale check, which would be 10%, but still 30 lizardmen are killed and 20 heavy horses go down, which is a pretty good dent on those expensive units. So now we begin turn 2. Before movement begins, the ballista fires at the elven archers from just outside longbow range, spearing 2 of them. Now the kobold crew has to spend 3 turns reloading. The Cyclops lobs a huge rock at the elves, smashing another 5. Again, that doesn't really accomplish much, but it is kind of satisfying. So simultaneously with the rock throwing and ballista fire, the elven archers take their beginning of turn fire at long range. And they kill another 30 lizardmen and another 20 heavy cavalry because the range is the same and the damage is the same, so the results are the same. Since both the horsemen and the lizardmen have taken 10% casualties from the arrow fire, they both have to make a morale check. So according to the monster manual, the lizardmen are 2 hit dice plus 3 monsters, so their base morale is 45. They are unorganized, so they get no formation bonus, and they're not fighting with a leader or an army standard that might give them some sort of morale boost. Their base morale is reduced 5% for every 10% of their unit casualties, so now they're at 40 base morale. They have to roll 40 on a D100 to make their morale check, which they do. And had the unit fail, it would have become shaken. So that was kind of lucky. They don't have a lot of morale to start with, and so they easily could start down that slippery slope of losing morale. The heavy cavalry are first level fighters, so their base morale is 40. They get +5 for being human, +5 for being elite troops, +5 for being mounted, and +5 for being in a line formation, and +10 for being heavy cavalry. So that brings their overall morale score to a respectable 70, but they have -5 for having suffered 10% casualties. So they have to roll under a 65 and a D100, which fortunately they do. So after the beginning of turn missile fire for turn 2, now the movement phase begins. So this turn, the elves and the dwarves are side A, which means they get to make half moves if they choose at both the beginning and the end of the movement phase, while the cavalry and the lizardmen, side B, can make their full move in the middle of the phase. So now the elves face an interesting choice. No doubt they were hoping to face a coalition of smaller and slower units that they could decimate and rout with a bunch of arrow fire. If they were just facing the lizardmen, for example, the elves could simply stand their ground this turn, fire 2 more volleys of arrows, which would become increasingly effective as the lizardmen moved closer. Then at the beginning of turn 3, the elves could fire a parting volley at the lizardmen before the movement phase, and then simply withdraw behind the line of dwarves if the casualties didn't cause the lizardmen to fail 2 morale tests, become disordered, and retreat, which is very likely. On the right wing of their line, however, the elves are not facing a bunch of slow foot troops. They're facing a unit of 200 heavy cavalry armed with heavy lances, which do double damage during a charge. So the heavy cavalry ride in close formation, basically stirrup to stirrup. And they're not as fast as medium cavalry or light cavalry. They can't break into open order formation like light cavalry, which makes light cavalry really fast. Still, in line formation, they have a base movement of 12 inches and a charge bonus of 5. Which means that even though they just galloped into the elves' longbow range, they're almost within charging range. Like here, that's about 18 inches. So the elves here have already fired once at the beginning of turn 2. Now, if they fire again, they won't be able to move at all. They'll fire in the middle of the turn instead of moving, and then they'll get an end of the turn shot, but they won't be able to make any movement. Discretion being the better part of valor and staring down a wall of heavy lances, the elves decide to initiate the second part of their plan, albeit a little bit sooner than they would have preferred. So unarmored elves like these have a base movement of 12 inches, which means they can move 6 inches during the first half of their movement phase. They are side A right now, which means they can move their half movement, and then side B will move their full movement, and then side A will move half movement again. So they get 1 half move, and they're going to use it. So they decide it's time to retreat behind the wall of dwarves. So the elves do an about-face maneuver. This costs them 1/4 of their total movement for the turn, so that's 3 inches. So they turn an about face, and because they have 6 inches for their half move, because they're moving half and then waiting and then moving half again, that leaves them 3 inches of movement left. Okay, so they have 6 inches of movement for their half move. They've used 3 inches to turn around. Now they're going to move 3 inches toward the dwarves, which will take them safely outside the charge range of the heavy cavalry. Then, once the heavy cavalry make their full move, falling short of their target, the elves can take their second half move, which will take them 6 inches through the dwarves. They can pass through the dwarves because they're a friendly unit, and there's only a 10% chance of disrupting the dwarves during the process. And they will end up essentially over here at the end of the turn. So next turn, the elves would be side B, which means that they would move a full move in the middle of the turn. So they have plenty of movement to back up a little bit, to turn back around. And once they've done that, move back a few inches, done another about face, they'll still be able to fire at the end of the turn using indirect fire where they can shoot over the dwarves into any oncoming troops, or if they want to be completely ruthless, wait till oncoming troops engage with the dwarves, then fire into the dwarves, and then the dwarves and the enemy would split any casualties. So depending on how ruthless you want your elves to be. Anyway, if their plan succeeds, they are safely behind the line of dwarves, and the dwarves can take the hits. And then the elves are still pretty much intact. They've taken a few hits from rocks and ballista fire, but other than that, there's still well over 1,000 of them. If that's the way it had worked out. Unfortunately, the elven general made one small miscalculation. So while heavy cavalry cannot break into the breezy, speedy, open order formation like light cavalry, a heavy horse unit can, like any troops, choose to leave an orderly formation and become an unorganized mob, screaming toward the enemy, much like the lizardmen, who couldn't form any formation. So heavy cavalry in line formation has a base speed of 12, plus a charge bonus of 5, so that's 17. So they could get right up to there, which was almost to the elves before the elves turned around and moved a few inches. Unorganized cavalry, however, has a base speed of 18, plus a charge bonus of 5, making their range 23. Even better, the movement cost for breaking into unorganized is 0. It costs nothing to break ranks and then charge forward like a mob. You do lose 30% of your damage when you're inflicting damage, and you lose any formation bonus for morale rolls. But those nerfs are going to be a small price to pay. So after the elves moved their half movement at the beginning of the movement phase, and it was time for the cavalry to move its full movement in the middle of the movement phase, They broke into unorganized at a movement cost of 0, charged forward, and basically 200 heavy horsemen ran right into the back of the elven archers. So the bowmen had killed 40 horsemen, leaving a total of 210 mounted soldiers. That's 105 in the front rank, which would attack on the charge. Heavy lances inflict double damage on the charge, so consulting the base damage chart, we have 105 charging heavy lances doing 756 points of damage versus unarmored opponents. Plus modifiers. Regardless of their armament, all charging troops get a 20% damage bonus on the first round. Plus, if they attack their opponents in the rear, they get an additional 40% on the first round. Elite troops, which the cavalry are, get another 10% bonus because they're good at their jobs, basically. But then there's also a minus 30% penalty for fighting as an unorganized mob, which these guys broke into for the movement bonus. So here's the Wargaming math. That's bonuses of 70%, minuses of 30%, for a first round damage bonus total of 40%, bringing the overall damage of the charge to 1,058 points. At 6 points per elf, that means 176 archers were bulldozed by the initial charge. But it gets worse. Now the elves have to make several morale checks. One, because they suffered 10% casualties. Another, because they're regular foot troops charged by mounted forces. And 2 more, because they were attacked from the rear. So that's a total of 4 morale checks. The elves' base morale is 40, plus 10 for being elves, another 5 for being in line formation. So that's 55. Then there's a 5% penalty for taking 10% casualties, and a 20% penalty for having their backs to the enemy, bringing the morale score down to 30. Unfortunately for the elves, morale penalties get worse once you start failing morale checks. So if a unit is shaken, for example, its morale drops 10 points. If that same unit fails another morale test and becomes disordered, then its base morale drops 20 points. And if a disordered unit fails a morale test, it routs, which is exactly what the elves did. So routed units, like this line of elves here, and because they're all one big unit, one big line, they all suffer the same fate. Routed units must immediately make 2 full moves, including a charge bonus, away from the enemy, and then rest 3 full turns, after which the morale rises to disordered. So even though only 16% of the archers actually died in the charge, because the whole elf line was a single unit, the remaining 924 elves ran screaming through the unit of dwarves, across the bedroom carpet for an additional 30 inches, where they had to rest for 3 turns before summoning enough courage to become a disordered unit. So obviously that was pretty cool and put a big smile on my face. So what happened next? Well, we'll never know, because about this time everybody had to go home. You know how wargaming is. You spend a couple of days prepping for a game, a couple of hours setting up a game, and then by the time you get to turn 2, half the day is gone. But presumably, the lizardmen would have approached the dwarvish line, probably lobbing javelins as they came, and eventually charged the line, and the dwarves being so slow wouldn't have been able to get away. So the heavy cavalry here, being unorganized, had no facing really, so they could have just moved away from the dwarves kind of at their leisure, then reformed and charged when they were ready. So they'd get 1 round of charge bonus. Of course, they weren't charging the dwarves in the rear, and the dwarves are armored, so it's a little bit different story. So they would get their charge bonus on the first turn, and then on the second turn of combat, the war horses get to fight. So that adds a little more damage, but you do lose the double damage from the heavy lances. And one little thing is that when cavalry are fighting foot troops that can fight back, it does have a slight negative effect on the morale, because they don't like when people can shot back. So, well, folks, thanks very much for watching. As always, we hope you enjoyed this look at my favorite wargaming moment of all time, using the classic Swords and Spells rules by Gary Gygax himself, published back in 1976, the bicentennial. If you like what we do here, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please give this video a big thumbs up, and please visit us online at our website, skirmishwargames.com.